Good morning, and welcome to an AI event on separating the facts from fiction, election disinformation on online platforms. Disinformation, misinformation, freedom of speech, internet censorship, and our First Amendment rights are all being questioned by society right now, specifically towards the use of today's internet tools and how the platforms that run social media outlets that host users' content are concerned. Who decides the answers to these questions? Should it be Congress or the Supreme Court? Who has weighed heavily in the last several weeks, which we'll be discussing? Are citizens seeing their views and their dislikes being amplified by social media and maybe not willing to take some responsibility for the discord in today's environment as the possible problem rather than blaming the internet tools? Founders of the internet infrastructure often commented that their hopes of what they called the interactive computer services, now known as the internet, would represent an extraordinary ability to advance education and informational resources for our citizens. Many of them spent our first decade of us here on the stage with the internet's growth and encouraging development of internet tools and resources around the world to help with education, cultural, political, and entertainment services that are be available anywhere, anytime. Our concerns of the misuse of the power of the internet used to be turned externally to countries who would promote digital authoritarianism and the lack of democratic information flow. Now we find the United States has spent the last decade mired in election cycles being the concern of the internet, and it's also being turned into a tool to sow discord amongst our own citizens. How are the citizens feeling about the upcoming elections and the information flow about candidates and campaigns? These are many of the questions we will be discussing at today's event, recognizing that underneath it all, the importance of how the internet continues as a vehicle of free flow of information is not only up to the United States, but it is important globally. So to introduce the people on my panel today, I'd like to introduce Quinta Jurek, who is a fellow in the governance studies at Brookings Institute. She is a senior editor at Lawfare, a contributing writer at The Atlantic. She has written and appeared in New York Times as well as the Washington Post, where she serves as an editorial writer. She is co-host of Lawfare's podcast, Arbiters of Truth, which I'm a huge fan of, a series of misinformation and disinformation, social media platforms, and online information ecosystems. Spencer Davis is a campaign and policy consultant based in Austin, Texas. Thanks for coming up. Where he is a founding partner of Guadalupe Strategies. He was most recently political director for Senator John Cornyn's re-election campaign in 2020. He's the executive director of Texas Victory, where he was also responsibility for all down ballot efforts in the state, winning 27 of 28 targeted down ballot races. And a graduate of Texas A&M University, he began his career as a data director for the Republican National Committee. Samir Jain is the Director of Policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT as it's known. He oversees the execution of CDT's policy agenda on strategy and represents the organizations before policymakers, regulatory agencies, civil society, industry, and the media. Samir brings 25 years of experience in government and private practice to the table, working as in the forefront of technology law, policy, and regulation. He served in the Obama administration as Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice and as Senior Director of Cybersecurity Policy for the National Security Council. He was a primary architect of the President's Policy Directive on the United States Cyber Incident Coordination and played a key role in the development of the executive order authorizing sanctions for malicious cyber-enabled activities. So we have a really good group of experts here today. If you want to participate in discussion, those of you who are still on Twitter should use hashtag AskAEI.tech, or you can email Jake at jake.easter@aei.org, and we'll be taking questions at the end of this discussion. So let's start with what everybody in Washington is thinking about right now, which is we have an election coming up on Tuesday. So top priority at the moment, Spencer, we've got the RNC concerned that they think that they're being suppressed. They have sued Google over this, and there is a lot of confusion about how and why this is happening. So will you just start with kind of the basics of why is it the RNC thinks they're being suppressed, and give us some baseline on this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all a question of email fundraising. And to frame this conversation correctly, I think just speaking from a campaign background, we have to remember that the most fundamental tool to a campaign today, whether it's state house or it's presidential, we can talk about digital advertising, we can talk about micro-targeting, door knocks, sending text messages, but none of that really happens without email fundraising. This kind of small dollar, speak to your base, and be able to fund the rest of the campaign's operations. And from 2016 to really last year, the story of that was we were just seeing exponential growth. And on the Republican side, that's due to more email fundraising. It's also due to Win Red, which was kind of our copy of Act Blue. And as we kind of expanded into this, we're now seeing this like kind of last year of through the last 4 quarters, we've actually been down. And that's quarter to quarter. It's not kind of comparing that to presidential years. And like some of those complaints and some of those gripes can come from this spam issue.
So just, when you're saying that it's down, you're saying the response is down, just so we're clear.
The actual dollars coming in
okay.
are down, yes. And so there was a suspicion among us that we're doing these fundraising campaigns that a lot of these emails had a really bad deliverability rate. And when we say deliverability, it's how many of these emails are actually showing up in a viewable inbox for a user and a donor, and how many of them are kind of getting swept into spam. And so at the RNC, they have 5 staffers that are just completely devoted to this question of deliverability. But they were seeing something that I also saw in my campaigns, and that was ultimately confirmed by a North Carolina State University study back in March of 2022 that said they are, you're seeing, especially on Gmail, a disproportionate amount of emails coming from Republican campaigns going to spam when comparing them to Democrat campaigns. For Democrats, it's below 10%, and for Republicans, it's somewhere above 65%. And so that's a concern, obviously, as we're trying to speak to our base and build fair elections and campaigns. And it's really kind of come to a head with this RNC lawsuit against Gmail. So RNC's side is they've been speaking to Google for the last 10 months. They usually have a very good deliverability rate. Again, they have 5 staffers devoted to it. It's normally north of 90%. But you'll see at the end of every single month, it suddenly drops down to 0%. And those end of months are the most important to a campaign because that's when you're doing your end of month fundraising and you're actually getting the most dollars per email. And so Google told the RNC, well, it's one of 3 issues. It's content, it's frequency, or it's user input. And those are the 3 things that any email service uses to build a spam filter. And for content, well, the RNC said, we've done some A/B tests. We sent the same exact copy to 2 different groups. One of those groups got almost 100% delivered, and one of those groups got 0% delivered, so we don't think it's content. We also don't think it's frequency because we're comparing how many emails we're sending a day and at any time of the month, and we don't think we're doing that much more than someone on the Democrat side. And we also don't think it's user input because we can see through Google's own tools that their spam usage reportage is somewhere below 1% every single day. So they, frustrated with this conversation, not feeling like they were getting enough, Google, their solution was to offer this pilot program. They got approved through an advisory opinion of the FEC. But the RNC is not signing up for that, publicly saying that it's a Trojan horse. They think it's giving Google too much data. But they also do have a legitimate gripe that these people that have signed up, that are actually receiving emails, are only receiving emails because they signed up for it. And so they think that Google is kind of building a double approval structure where they have to sign up for the RNC to receive these emails, but then they also have to sign up, kind of just confirm through Google that they want to receive these emails. And so they're not participating in this pilot program.
So the pilot program was designed specifically for political action groups or campaigns to be able to sign up, and now they're suspicious about signing up to then verify that they would get their information flow. That seems like an awkward situation. I mean, Gmail is one of the largest users, I mean, for individuals. So their whole premise is to have targeted recommendations. Is there also the possibility that I'm a huge user of the spam button, right? Just certain things I don't want to like, and then the algorithm eventually drives that mail away from me into my spam, and so it's interesting. I did read the North Carolina study that I feel like it's. I'd be curious to see if it comes out to be anecdotal or if they it's the finding what you're looking for. The fact that the FEC came into this, I found interesting. That they thought that they needed to have a role in how we communicate. So can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so Google went to the FEC for this because, well, they were worried about 2 things. One, they felt like they needed to confirm who was actually a candidate. So the FEC, kind of housing all of that paperwork, could confirm to Google what campaigns would actually be able to participate in this pilot program. And then Google's also worried about the issue of in-kind contributions. So would giving extra service by building this pilot program and whitelisting political campaigns, would that then have to show up as an in-kind on those campaigns reports? So the answer coming back from the FEC in August was no. You're cleared to do this, and they've set this up. And maybe a little bit ironically, the DNC, who during the comment-taking portion of this rulemaking said that absolutely we should not build this pilot program. It's giving bad users of email an extra leg up. It's delivering what is spam material. It's whitelisting it and just delivering it straight to inboxes. They've actually become a participant in the pilot program, but the RNC, who was maybe you could say was designed for, have not.
So that brings us to the bigger question of the challenge of the internet right now, which is what stays up, what goes down, who's in charge, who gets to decide do I get to decide what I'm seeing, and are the algorithms continuing to give me things that somehow I've been able to design it. The internet's a happy place for me, but there's a lot of people that are doing things apparently that are unhappy. So moving beyond Gmail, can we talk about the most recent, the Supreme Court taking several cases, and Quint, I'm going to start with you because you do an actual podcast about this. So talk to us about Gonzalez, and I'm going to enunciate the other one right. Starts with the T.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are two cases that the Supreme Court recently granted certiorari, and we're expecting you'll hear them later this term. Gonzalez v. Google and Twitter v. Tamne. They both concern a problem that has been on people's radar for a long time. There's been litigation on these similar areas before. This is the first time that it's gotten to the Supreme Court. And essentially, the fact pattern in each case involves an instance where somebody was hurt or killed in a terrorist attack. And the petitioners are arguing the plaintiffs were arguing in the lower courts that the platforms had liability for this because they in some way allowed it to happen. They boosted algorithmic content that spread propaganda from ISIS. They allowed people to get in touch with one another that helped them plan terrorist attacks. This is very broad and not specific to these specific cases, but that's kind of the general fact pattern that you're seeing. And so the court has now granted certiorari in these two cases to decide it itself. They relate to similar issues, but there are different specific questions in each case. So the first case, Gonzalez versus Google, has to do with the scope of Section 230 protection. So that's the law that shields platforms from most liability for user-generated content. And the question presented in Gonzalez concerns whether a platform's use of an algorithm to boost or downrank content is protected by Section 230 or not. The argument being in this case, well, a terrorist group, that there was content that was boosted from this terrorist group on the algorithm. That's not user-generated content. That's content that's produced by the platform itself. And therefore, the plaintiffs are arguing that it should be able to be held liable. That's a hugely important case. I think it could really reshape how Section 230 works and how the internet functions. The second case, Tamne, again, similar fact pattern, but the specific question here has to do with the statute under which Twitter would be held liable, the Anti-Terrorism Act. And so that is sort of a particular question of statutory interpretation, whether setting aside Section 230 for the moment, or if you accept that this platform could potentially be held liable under Section 230, that the plaintiffs would be able to recover certain damages for this conduct that their plaintiffs are arguing that the platform contributed to the terrorist attack in some way. That's the general overview. There are a lot of nuances there, and I'm very curious for Sameer's take. I think the bottom line is really that these cases could be extremely significant in how we understand the future of the internet.
So Sameer, let's talk about what's at stake here.
Sure. As Quinta said, these particular cases concern terrorist content, but I think they have implications really for third-party or user-generated content writ large. Because if, in fact, providers like Google or social media services can be held liable for this kind of third-party content, and they face that risk of liability. I mean, the theory that's long underlied Section 230 is that if they face that kind of liability, they may really, as a rational matter, have little choice but to start being much more aggressive in taking down content. Because if you're potentially liable when someone posts some content and then there's a complaint, someone says, hey, that's defamatory, or hey, that's supporting terrorism, if you're a service provider, your rational choice may well be, I'm just simply going to take that content down in response to that notice. Or more broadly, if you think about terrorism, for example, if you're a third party, if you're a service provider and you're now potentially liable for terrorist content, maybe you put in place an automated tool that just does a keyword search for terrorism and takes down all content related to terrorism. But that's going to be positive content as well, right? It could be journalism about terrorism, it could be anti-terrorist content. And so there's a real risk that depending on how the court decides 230, that you may end up with less beneficial speech and suppression of free expression as a result. Because, and the other point I would make is that it's important to realize that Section 230 is not just about the Facebooks and Googles of the world. It's about all providers who benefit. And in some ways, it's the smaller providers who are going to be most at risk, because they're the ones who don't have the resources to defend this against this kind of litigation. And they may well decide either they shut down or they don't allow for third-party content. I mean, if you're a newspaper, why allow for comments from your users if you're potentially liable for those comments? Or they may, again, because they don't really have the ability to employ thousands of people to engage in content moderation, they may take these very broad steps of, I'm just not going to, allow content that's terrorist. I mean, just to give you an example, when there was a small provider who was being told that terrorists are using your platform to spread propaganda, and his response was, I'm a small provider, all of this is happening in Arabic, I don't have anyone who understands Arabic, so I'm just going to block all Arabic content. And obviously a lot of that content was beneficial, was useful, had nothing to do with terrorists, but that was basically the only choice he had, because he had no other option to separate out the potentially harmful content from other content.
So then we have two other cases that are asking us to do the just opposite, which are the state of Florida and the state of Texas, and they, to oversimplify, says they really want to keep everything up. So how does this all play out, or like what are we looking at in the next year of, does the internet become a highly regulated place, or does it all fall down and end in tears? What do you guys think?
I mean, you're right. I mean, there are two cases that I think everyone expects to go to the Supreme Court, or at least one of them will go to the Supreme Court, I think, which are challenges, First Amendment challenges to laws passed by Texas and Florida, both of which in different ways require providers not to moderate content. So in Texas, the law, for example, says that providers shouldn't engage in what it calls viewpoint-based discrimination in terms of how it moderates content, which sounds, in some sense sounds, oh, that's a good idea, but when you think about it, if you think about a subject like suicide, we may want providers, for example, to take down content that promotes suicide while leaving up content that provides resources. If you're thinking of self-harm, these are places to go. Or so there are lots of ways in which providers engage in viewpoint-based discrimination in their content moderation that I think most people actually would find to be a good thing. Or even in the terrorist content, maybe we want providers to take down terrorist propaganda, but we want people to be able to talk about why terrorism is bad or those kinds of things. And so the question in those cases isn't really about Section 230, it's about, do providers have a First Amendment right, what they would call editorial discretion, akin to what newspapers have, to make their own decisions about what content to leave up, what content to take down? Or is that what the Fifth Circuit in the Texas case called essentially censorship, and that those providers shouldn't, as a matter of First Amendment, be able to make those decisions, and in fact should leave all of that content up?
Spencer, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think at heart, what Texas and Florida are trying to do is kind of take the spirit of the First Amendment and make that content moderation. And I think a former CEO of Reddit, and I'm losing his name right now, but yesterday he had a really good thread on what content moderation is, and that it's never actually been about the speech itself, but about the environment that it's creating. Because he points out, rightfully so, that, and going back to spam, we have always identified spam as something that we need to remove from any kind of healthy online marketplace of ideas, or just a place to enjoy connecting with friends, because as we know, spam can just take over any kind of community that it's in, and that's all it becomes. And so we are fine with banning spam, but First Amendment actually protects that. I mean, the United States Postal Service will send as much spam to my mailbox at home as possible. It's First Amendment protected speech. And so I think that's, I think Samir was getting to, is kind of that difficulty of how to have content moderation while creating a healthy space. But I don't think we can just throw up our hands and say, well, everything out there is valuable. Content moderation is too hard, and so we should allow all speech because it'll create instances of radicalization. It lends itself to conversations about terrorists being activated and radicalized, and it's just really not worth it.
Because you've done a lot of shows about this.
I haven't solved it yet. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand, as Samir pointed to, that so these sets of cases are sort of touching on different legal issues, even as they all speak to what the internet looks like, how we think about, how we curate what we see online. And I think that's important to understand because it's a reminder that, often you'll see in public discussions, people will point to, Section 230 as the law that allows hate speech online. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, that's actually the First Amendment, right? Section 230 has to do with a slightly different but still important question. And so, it's a really complicated network of laws, of jurisprudence built up over time, of sort of really difficult, fine-grained questions about, how do we moderate content in languages that maybe we don't speak? How do we hire enough people? How do we tune our algorithm to filter out this but not that? And so I think that this space is a fascinating but often a really difficult one because at the same time as it touches on these very high altitude questions that a lot of people care very deeply about, free speech, how they choose what they see, how they choose what they say. And it's become, I think for that reason, quite politicized, where you often see, at this point, Democrats essentially calling for platforms to take more content down, Republicans calling for platforms to leave more content up. At the end of the day, these are really technical, specialized issues, and so it becomes quite hard to move from that very abstract level down to the sort of nitty-gritty of, okay, how are we going to implement this? And how are we going to implement it in a way that means that I can still use this social media platform to communicate with my friends, and it won't just be drowned out in spam. And that, I think, is crucial to understand, but also why it is so difficult to sort of untangle these questions.
I think just to add to that, another layer of complication here is the fact that we're not just talking about the United States. We're talking about a global system, and the First Amendment doesn't apply outside the United States. And so, for example, in Europe, you now have a law called the Digital Services Act, which imposes various kinds of content moderation obligations, which couldn't be done here, I think, under the First Amendment. But platforms are going to have to obey. I mean, even Elon Musk, when he's talking about free speech, acknowledges that Twitter is going to have to obey the Digital Services Act, and so you're going to have competing, potentially contradictory content moderation regimes throughout the world. And from a technical standpoint, it's very difficult to run a service in which you provide certain content in one place and different content in another. And so, so it's not going to be just up to the United States or the Supreme Court either. It's going to be how do we reconcile all these different laws and what do service providers do in response to those kind of competing or contradictory obligations.
I just have a question about the transparency and the challenge of algorithms, because the companies will rightfully say that the algorithm is their secret sauce. So they don't want, it's like putting all their code out there. They don't want to do it completely. But now we have seen, I think in a very positive fashion, trust and safety officers are now more prevalent in a lot of companies, especially in the social media companies. We tried to get the trust and safety officer of TikTok on, unfortunately wasn't able to make it because they actually created a election help center or something like that. And I thought, they're the only one. After I heard about that, I went to see if anybody else had one, and they didn't. And I thought, they're either front-running the problem or they are just reading the tea leaves. I'm not sure there. But is there a balance in the terms of service and terms of use on a level of transparency that would help with this whole situation, or is that just I'm being an optimist there?
No, I think transparency is definitely a positive thing. We've long called for transparency. There are civil societies out there with, for example, what are called the Santa Clara Principles, which lay out in quite a bit of detail the kinds of transparency that I think it would be useful for everyone to see and would inform public policy decisions about this. Because knowing not only what rules that they apply, but sort of what are the consequences of those rules? Like how much content are they taking down, in what categories, to what degree are they taking down content in response to government requests as opposed to of their own volition? And greater detail about sort of how they apply those rules. And I think all of that would be helpful, and I think it would be helpful because it would also allow us to have more informed discussions from a policy and a legal standpoint, because we better understand what are the ramifications if we change 230 in this way, or if we interpret the First Amendment in a particular way. So I think transparency is all to the good. I mean, obviously you can go too far, as you were suggesting, where if you provide the details of all the algorithm and people can then game those algorithms so that they can bypass filters and things like that. So there can be such a thing as too much transparency, but we're not even close to that, I think, as a general matter.
Yeah, I think finding that fine line is really the challenge here, because we don't have an industry perspective up here, someone working for one of these social media platforms, but their answer would be that. It's that you're able to, if you know too much about it, you're able to game it. And it's that's the reasoning they gave for pulling back some of their APIs 4 or 5 years ago, was if you provide too much information in real time, well, that just activates bigger and better bots, which we're learning. I wasn't the first one to bring up Twitter, by the way. I'm kind of excited about that. We just saw the problem with identifying fraud and bots. Elon Musk learned that for us, right? And trying to identify just how many were out there, even that's a question. So I think the industry perspective is always going to be, everything that we provide is good transparency. Everything that we're required to provide is too much bad transparency. But I agree with Samir. I think there's a much better middle ground that we haven't reached yet.
Yeah, I'll join the transparency cheerleading squad. And also, since we've now broken the seal on referencing Twitter, I will say, Twitter has really been, there's been a movement among major social media platforms toward greater transparency in recent years. And I think it's fair to say that Twitter has been at the forefront there in many different ways, in providing reports about how their policies are implemented, often they would announce that they were testing out new content moderation ideas. You might remember if you used Twitter, there was a while where if you went to retweet a tweet that had a link in it that you hadn't actually clicked on, it would bother you to click on it first.
They say, hey, do you want to read the article?
Exactly. Annoying a lot of people.
I kind of love the engineer the group that thought that up. They're like, well, they're not reading it. Let's just say that.
Exactly. But they were very open about, we're testing different things to see what works to make our platform healthier and better. And so I will say that one of the things that I'm keeping an eye on under Elon Musk's version of Twitter is what will become of that transparency team. I do think that we're definitely seeing more of a trend toward transparency, so I don't think if it ends at Twitter, that means it ends elsewhere, but it's worth, as we're all watching what happens, that's something that's worth paying attention to. One other point that I'll note is when we're talking about these 2 First Amendment cases that we're all expecting will come up before the Supreme Court, the Florida and Texas litigation, at issue in those cases is also transparency provisions in the Texas and Florida laws. So those laws contain provisions that essentially tell platforms how they can and can't moderate, and that's what we've been talking about so far. But there's also language in there that says, platforms have to make certain information public. Now we can quibble over whether the particular way that those provisions are designed is perhaps ideal, whether they require too much or too little. The platforms themselves are arguing that those requirements violate the First Amendment along with the requirements for content moderation. And so I do think that there's going to be an interesting question here. Most of the attention has been focused on the outright content moderation provisions, but the Supreme Court is going to have an opportunity to consider this question of, do transparency provisions for tech companies How does the First Amendment interact with those? The technology companies are arguing, it's as if you're asking the New York Times or the Washington Post to give you a window into their editorial deliberations. That should be protected. I think that there's an alternative argument where you could say, these are, they're not quite the same as a newspaper. They're something different. And perhaps that there is a middle ground there that we can find where a certain level of transparency can be required by the government without violating the First Amendment. Personally, that's kind of the space that I would prefer. I think that's a middle ground, as we've all been saying. But it is notable to me that the tech companies involved in this litigation are really pushing back against that as hard as they can.
I think transparency requirements is really best case scenario. And I think they'll wake up to that and realize that after these cases are judged, after we kind of get through whatever maybe 230 reform is going to happen in Congress this next session. But it's the best case they're going to get. I think, thinking of 230 in the abstract, 230 is the greatest small c conservative experiment of all time. Like, we really went out and said more than 25 years ago, we were just not going to allow, not total throwing our hands up and not having any regulation in this space, but for the most part, taking away the worst of the teeth in being able to subscribe or prescribe liability to that case. So these transparency requirements are kind of a good middle ground where it's not that we're going to force you to develop a product that doesn't exist yet in order to fight this. What we need is better content moderation. But we just need you to tell us more about what you are doing and what is happening. I think that's best case scenario for industry. I think, yeah.
And I would just note, whatever happens in the United States, the Digital Services Act, I'm going to bring that up again, has actually quite extensive transparency requirements. And again, they don't have the First Amendment there as a barrier. So I think we're actually going to move in that direction regardless. And it's a little hard to believe that big providers are going to provide transparency in Europe and not provide the equivalent transparency in the United States, because I don't think that's going to be a tenable position for them to take. So I think transparency is coming one way or another.
So to combine two things, which is the Digital Services Act and Twitter and Elon Musk, which actually has been a thing they've discussed at one point, it is interesting because part of me on Twitter says, I'm a free marketer. It's a little bit of a petri dish. We were just talking about the blue check earlier, and the blue check for a nanosecond supposedly meant something, and now it means you paid Twitter. And so is that going to dissolve? Versus the Digital Service Act, where you now have a bunch of regulations which tends to, in the attempt to make something mean more, just usually slows down the process and while people figure out how to game whatever that is. So we're getting to an interesting clash in multiple venues of regulation versus all these things that are kind of fundamental to, at least, to Americans around free speech. We see how the other countries are also having the same challenge of the way that they look at this space. So how do we kind of the global worldview, and I appreciate you bringing Europe in because they're having a field day regulating our tech industry innovators at the moment, is making sure that what we do doesn't tip the scale too hard and the whole thing breaks is my biggest fear.
Yeah, I don't know that anyone knows the answer to that question. We're embarking on a great experiment, both in Europe, I think, and potentially, depending on what the Supreme Court here in the United States as well. Because, I think, there's great dissatisfaction really across the spectrum, sometimes for different reasons, but nonetheless dissatisfaction with sort of how particularly the big providers, social media providers, are handling these issues. And also a feeling that why is it that an Elon Musk or a Mark Zuckerberg or pick your titan should be the one exercising this much influence over our public discourse, which is what they do. And no one elected them. It doesn't seem like they're the right decision makers. I think Mark Zuckerberg himself has said that on occasion. And so if they're not the right ones, but you have, there are clear dangers in the government regulating. I mean, that's why we have the First Amendment in the United States. Who does the regulation, and sort of how do you do that? I think that's the big question. I don't think anyone has the good answer to that.
That and maybe thinking there's public safety, just set your device down for a minute and walk outside, right? There's this other thing. We were talking earlier about common carrier and that whole idea of, to Mark Zuckerberg, who probably thought it was a platform and he had no idea that the the party or the, all the things that were going to happen were going to break out on it, and he was going to have to manage things at such a major consequential level. So does the idea of a common carrier for these platforms help hinder the conversation? Spencer, you were having a little conversation about this earlier.
Yeah, I don't know if they qualify. I don't think that these large social media platforms are common carriers for the same reason I don't think that they're monopolies. And I think it's because they really, in most cases, just don't charge anything. And I think if you need to quantify what a monopoly is, I'm just not convinced by any argument that doesn't include something about price competition. I think that just needs to be there in order to say XYZ company is a monopoly. And my understanding of common carrier law is a lot of that is built on natural monopoly law. Now, I think it's more complicated than that. Common carrier law sometimes is just, it's a common carrier because we say it's a common carrier. But it's really, I think that's coming to a head with, it's the RNC Gmail issue. RNC in California court, when they filed the lawsuit, made extensive citations of former common carrier laws. They're attempting to peg Gmail as a common carrier. And of course, that's what we're seeing in Europe. But I think to the larger point of what's kind of the Digital Services Act, right? I don't think I ever personally have seen EU Commission, like a headline, EU Commission makes new rule, and I've ever been particularly happy about it. Because I think they're treading dangerous ground where they're getting too involved in the market. And I think what they're really end up doing is the only people that are able to follow these new rules are going to be the large companies. Yep. And they try to cut that middle ground by drawing a line of who needs to answer to these regulations. And everyone has a different way of doing it. I mean, there are like probably 50 different bills on 230, even just here in the United States. Is it employee headcount? Is it monthly active users? Is it gross annual revenue? And everyone draws that line in a different way. And we don't even have an answer to that. I don't think we're in a place yet where we can go through and start saying, okay, here's the people, this is the bucket that needs to follow our new onerous rules, and here's the bucket that doesn't have to yet.
I just want to, on common carrier, just pick up a point that Spencer made earlier about what is content moderation about, which is the creation, I agree, it's about the creation of communities and different kinds of communities. One might be directed at children, one might be more of a free-for-all, one might be focused on a particular subject. If you have a common carriage obligation, you can't do that, right? Because it basically requires you to carry everything. And so that idea of sort of creating different spaces, different online communities goes out the door. And I think also there's this sort of, I think in some ways, misunderstanding, and I've heard it from Elon Musk several times, the idea that, well, if you allow everyone to speak, then that's free speech writ large. But it's far more complicated than that, right? Because we know that part of what goes on online is significant harassment, significant trolling, significant negative kinds of behaviors that drive people off of and basically make it so that they can't speak online. And that happens particularly with marginalized communities, for example. And so if you allow everyone to speak, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to have an equal voice, because what's going to happen is there are going to be people who, as a result of other people's speech, are forced offline or don't feel free to speak. And so, having rules in place is actually necessary to create a community in which everyone actually has an equal right to speak.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I'll give a shout out to a report that Samir's organization, CTT, just put out about online harassment and abuse of political candidates, particularly women of color, showing that women of color running for political office receive by far more threats, abuse, harassment online. And I think that's a great example of how some speech can drown out other speech. These are cases in which somebody decides, they're going to throw their hat in the ring, they're going to participate in the public discourse, in the political conversation, they want to run for public office, and they're hit with a wave of speech, but abusive, harassing, violent speech, and in some cases decide, you know what, I don't want to be part of this conversation anymore. I think you see that as well in how, to go back to Twitter, since that's the example of the day, there are a lot of conversations of people saying, if more people come on here and are allowed to engage in abusive, harassing behavior, I'm gone. I don't want to be here anymore. And that's an example of how allowing a free-for-all can actually drive some people out of the room. And I think really drives home that point that just, it's not a case of more speech is better. It's really a situation where we have to think very carefully about how do we, curate these environments and communities.
I think about that, the moderator's dilemma is moderation is usually started with the best of intentions of like, okay, so there's a few corner cases and let's see if we can just figure those out and we'll just cabin those off. And then it becomes the majority of what's on your platform and everything is a decision, go, no go decision. And I think we're asking a lot of people to decide things about, when I think about it mentally, I'm like, we have given people both a microscope and a microphone, megaphone, and they're using both at a level we never expected, and we're not sure which one to dial up or down on. Is it the, this perpetual information flow that, especially now that you definitely are managing thought bubbles. You can see two people that have spent the same 24 hours and just looked at different information all day long, and then when they go to amplify it, they're not doing any sort of cross-functional information check on that. And so we have so many things that are important to all this, which brings us to, we are in Washington, D.C. What do we think Congress is going to do about this? Because they don't like to be shown up by the Supreme Court all that often, and that's kind of where we're headed. Any thoughts on who our congressional friends are going on this?
I mean, the difficulty is that on the one hand, you can find plenty of Republicans and Democrats who both say Section 230 is terrible, or we need to get rid of Section 230. But I think it was Spencer or someone noted earlier, they have very different reasons and outcomes that they're looking for in getting rid of Section 230. By and large, Republicans want to get rid of Section 230 because they want less content moderation, and we see that obviously in the Texas and Florida laws. On the other hand, Democrats want to get rid of Section 230 by and large because they want platforms to be more aggressive in policing misinformation, disinformation, harassment. So while on the one hand you've got sort of almost, you might even say something approaching a consensus that Section 230 needs to change, you have almost diametrically opposed views as to what you want to accomplish through that change. And that makes making the change very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Other thoughts on congressional?
I might reframe my answer a little bit differently than what I think they'll do, and maybe go as far as to say what I think they should do. And I feel like sometimes maybe the last person in DC that thinks Section 230 is good as it is, right? Again, I think it's just one of the most powerful small c conservative experiments and successful ones of all time. I think if I was trying to answer the question of what should they do if they have to do something, I think we need to take it in order of what is actually accomplishable today. And I think we need to stay focused on what is technically feasible today, right? So I think one of the things that can change right now is FECA. So this whole conversation out of 2016 of Russia funding political speech and political advertisements on Facebook, I don't know if it was ever answered in a satisfactory way. I think there are know your customer rules that can be required from a liability standpoint, and that we can just make a new carve out to 230, as we've done with copyright infringement, as we've done with FOSTA, in place foreign entities trying to fund or direct American political action in there. I think that's a step that can really one of the only realistic steps that can be taken right now. I think if I'm setting goals for what can be accomplished next, it's probably creating some kind of liability for bot or other fraudulent actors. Again, going back to Elon Musk's struggles with just identifying how many bots were at Twitter, I don't know if that's answerable in the next 5 years. And then I know, of course, the topic of conversation in SCOTUS right now, a topic of conversation, a lot of these bills that were presented but didn't really go anywhere in this Congress is algorithmic amplification or modification. And I struggle to be able to see any way from a technical standpoint to actually implement liability there because I just don't think that, especially natural language processing, is there yet. I think the platforms can get really good at things that need to identify images and videos. I think we've seen that with copyright infringement. Content ID from YouTube is a really powerful tool, but it's kind of a simple technical question of this is the content that is copyright. This content looks a lot like it, even if it's been flipped or zoomed in or zoomed out or the color is changed. It can identify that. I don't think we have anything sophisticated or powerful enough yet to be able to understand context of political conversations, especially if they're text-based. But I know, Samir, that's your realm of expertise, so I won't speak too long on that.
No, I mean, we actually have a report on precisely this point as well.
My homework, yeah.
The limitations of automated content moderation. And you're right. I mean, even in the image context, and even if you're talking about something narrow like child sex abuse material, there are good tools out there that can match, that can identify known child sexual abuse material. Like if people have seen a terrible picture before and it's in a database, they can see if it's getting recirculated. But they can't. There are no tools that are very good at identifying even new child sex abuse material. And that's just that very narrow, fairly defined category. And once you go beyond that to political discussion, it becomes nearly impossible because context and all these factors make such a difference. And then I would just add on the algorithmic amplification point, I think one of the points that I hope that will become clear to the court is that this notion that you can sort of separate out amplified content as just this sort of small subset of content and leave Section 230 in place for everything else is a false dichotomy entirely. Pretty much everything we see on the internet is the product of algorithms and amplification. I mean, if you think about search engines, what is Google doing when it shows you the first page of search engines? It's recommending these are the best sites in response to your query. So if you say recommendations are no longer protected by Section 230, okay, that means search engines are no longer protected by Section 230. Your Facebook feed is engineered in lots of different ways. I mean, if nothing else, it's boosting your friends' posts as opposed to random people's posts. So pretty much everything we see in some level is some form of recommendation or product of algorithm or curation. So if you sort of say that no longer is protected by Section 230, you're essentially gutting Section 230.
Yeah, if I can weigh in briefly. I do think we have seen in recent years a sort of increased movement toward carving out, as you mentioned, certain areas from 230 in the proposals that have been put forward. So we've seen, for example, proposals to exempt algorithmic amplification in some form from Section 230 protections, but as Samir points out, the rub is always going to be in how exactly do you define the boundaries there. And I actually do think we have a great example of how this can go terribly wrong, which is FOSTA, a law that created carve-outs to Section 230 protections for content that was related in some way to sex trafficking. That sounds like, we wouldn't want platforms to have protections for liability for that. The problem was that the way that the law was written was sort of both incredibly broad and incredibly convoluted at the same time. And you ended up with a situation where platforms were just not sure what they needed to take down or not, and ended up removing, as Samir mentioned earlier, that could happen, just whole swaths of speech that didn't necessarily need to be taken down, which had sort of measurably negative impacts on certain communities, particularly of marginalized people and sex workers. And so I think that is an example of how if Congress says, we'd like to create a carve-out of some kind, there really needs to be care and specificity put into how we're defining what is carved out and making sure that platforms know what they can and can't do, because otherwise you really, really risk opening a Pandora's box in the same way that I worry that the Supreme Court might do in Gonzalez.
Yeah, the challenge of laws being a lagging indicator to the technology is, I feel like, a chase that we're never going to get in front of. But you said the intent was good. It was the ability to figure it all out that has become exceptionally challenging. I can't believe there are no questions. But I did get a note just saying the internet is telling me I was wrong about something. That Facebook has an election monitoring center too, and it is something that they asked that clarify. I'm sorry, Meta. Didn't mean to not say that you don't have really good things going on in that space as well. So, I guess, what do you think 2023 is? Is it going to be just a hellscape? I mean, where are we headed?
I think I'm actually pretty optimistic. I mean, I think overall,
I learned something about you.
Dangerous game.
So you're a sadist. That's great. That's good to know.
Yeah, maybe I just haven't seen it enough. I don't know. I've been off Twitter for a long time. I think 2016 social media platforms got sucker punched. I think in 2018 they got kicked while they were down, and in 2020 they did some things right. I mean, it's hard to say because I think our conversation has been, in the last 2 years, focused on the most dangerous form of election disinformation possible, which is trying to convince people that their vote didn't count, right? Because if you break down, what I do is at its most basic point, you're giving people an opportunity to go into the polling booth and at least every 2 years and say, well, I generally agree with everything that happened in the last 2 years, or I generally disagree with it. And saying kind of this like, oh, ballots are being thrown out in Maricopa County, or the votes in Pennsylvania didn't count, or 300,000 votes appeared overnight in Michigan or Wisconsin or anything like that. Goes right at it. But people's trust that their vote counts is actually very, very solid. Because if you ask people generally, do you think that elections are fair in the United States? You're not going to get a very confidence-building answer, and that wouldn't kind of condition or quantify my optimism. But if you ask them, what is your confidence that your local elections will run well? It's always above 85%. And that was true in October of 2020, it was true of November of 2020, and it's true as of a couple weeks ago when Pew Research asked the question again. So I think there's that specific situation. There's been a limited ability for disinformation to actually change people's minds of how their votes count. They still trust that their vote counted, but of course it doesn't make right to I think Quintus' point earlier that a lot of this disinformation is targeted specifically at individuals. I think your example was candidates of color, and in this situation we can say elections administrators. I think Pennsylvania has seen turnover of something like 50 of 57. I don't want to quote myself on those numbers. Election administrators. But by and large, I think from some of the polling that we're seeing, those threats and that harassment are not coming from anyone that they're actually serving as an election administrator.
So do we feel like democracy is being challenged by all this? And I mean, are we in a posture that we feel like we can, win this? We just have so many things in play at the same time. Where we're taking back to next Tuesday, we do have disinformation, misinformation campaigns going on that it's hard to tell what's truth and not truth in campaigns in general. But we also are starting to see, people showing up to protect ballot boxes because they think that things are going to happen. They have read things online. I'm somebody who actually likes to vote absentee because it just avoids all of that. Yeah. But and then we also have seen some states change and augment the rules a long time ago, which was probably smart about not trying to make everything happen on one day, and being able to use some of our tools to not have this concentrated point of people all getting in one space that may not be the safest place for them all to be. So any thoughts about this coming Tuesday and what we think we're going to see over the weekend?
Look, I mean, I have to take a little less optimistic view, unfortunately. That's fair. I do think there's a chance that democracy is at risk. I mean, because I do think, it may well be that people think, are relatively confident about their own vote or their local elections, but I do think there's a broader skepticism fed by some of our political leaders about our election integrity more generally, and that if we ever get to a point where a big chunk of Americans feel like if their candidate or their party has lost, then the election was illegitimate. That is a really fundamental premise on which our democracy is based. And so if and I feel like we may be getting to a point where there's just a big chunk of people who, if their candidate loses, they just think that means the election was illegitimate. And if we ever get to that point, and I think, the disinformation and misinformation we're seeing online contribute to that belief. And so to me, that's a pretty scary proposition.
Understand that?
Yeah, I'll second the pessimism there. Unfortunately, I do think that the overlay of obviously existing political problems, growing extremism onto this question of internet platforms really underlines that I think content moderation can certainly help. But we're not going to be able to content moderate our way out of this problem. The underlying issues are fundamentally political questions. I do think that, one of the ways that discourse around content moderation was shaped after 2016 is that there was a concept, because of the particular context of Russian election interference, that, falsehoods were coming in from abroad. And that if you could only bar Russian trolls in St. Petersburg from posting on Twitter, that would somehow fix the problem. And I think obviously what we have seen in recent years is that is unfortunately not true. And it is far, far harder to tell somebody who, a Pennsylvania voter who really believes that the 2020 election was stolen and is posting about that on Twitter. Moderating that is a very different question than taking down a tweet from someone in St. Petersburg working at the Internet Research Agency pretending that they're a voter in Pennsylvania. And these are, for that reason, these are really, really tough questions.
I always wonder if those Russians actually start to care at some point, if they've been working on these campaigns for so long. They're like, no, that guy's got to win. Jake has done a good job of reminding me there's people in the room. So, questions from the audience? Right here in front. Yeah. Can you please identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Anjali Galati, and I'm a master's graduate from Georgetown.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Social media platforms allow users to shape their feeds based on their likes, their shares, and who they block in a way that creates the illusion that everyone agrees with them and their opinions and kind of promotes polarization. So should social media platforms be obliged to modify the algorithm itself, the strength of the AI, to make users experience their feeds in less of an opinion vacuum?
You've made me just think there should be something, instead of putting ads in, they have to remind you that not everybody loves you all the time. Like just a little tick you down a little bit if they're realizing that everybody's enjoying everything that you're doing. The world's really not like that.
Without it making it seem like an opposing opinion is just like a troll. Because someone else's feed may be full of opinions that to them are very valid and are their values, and to another person, those opinions may seem like spam.
Maybe they could recommend articles for them to read. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? It's a good question. It's a tough one because the whole platform is basically designed to let you see what you say you want to see. That's part of the targeting.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. There's actually been some really interesting academic research suggesting that effect may not be as strong as we've thought recently. This idea of a filter bubble, that perhaps there's some small portion of people who do sort of craft filter bubbles for themselves, but the rest of us maybe not so much. Or perhaps that the effect of having, being able to curate your feed actually doesn't affect your political perceptions as much as you might think. Which I think, again, really underlines, and I'll keep banging this drum, the question that, a lot of these things are empirical questions that have empirical answers. And the issue is sort of that things are moving so quickly and the conversation around content moderation is changing so quickly that, it takes a while for the researchers to actually come out with that paper. But I do think it's a very good question, and I'll be interested to see if that research continues in that direction or if we move back toward the filter bubble idea.
They usually find out something really interesting 5 years too late. We need to see if we can get the academics to come up a little more to speed. Questions over here? He's saying ladies first.
My name's Kelsey Ritchie Firestone. I work for a tech startup that focuses a lot on election-related mis and disinformation. So first of all, it's super helpful to hear about a lot of the underlying issues of content moderation. So I think kind of focusing a lot on Section 230, on kind of the regulatory regime is really helpful for understanding the symptom of mis and disinformation. So kind of bringing that into the context of what happens on Tuesday. I've noticed a lot from kind of trends from 2020 that 2020 was all about online conversation that cast doubt in the election, whereas trends in 2022 seems like it's kind of online calls to action for real life impact, whether it is armed poll watchers or whether it is people kind of taking photos of voters at polls that they suspect of being mules. So I'm curious, one, if that is something that you have kind of witnessed in your research on this, it's kind of an evolving trend in the mis and disinformation space. And then also, if you think that real world impact has a chance of driving the policy discussion in kind of a more urgent fashion, whether in Congress or in front of the Supreme Court.
You know what? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Shane mentioned this earlier about elections and maybe 2020, is that some of the issue was that people just weren't counting early enough. And I think that's kind of symptomatic of what we're this larger conversation of content moderation and changing 230 is that, we have responsibilities as citizens, and as citizens, we're all members of the government in kind of a philosophical way, to be able to enforce these things, and we can't, just because it's hard, then make it required of the actual platforms where this stuff is happening. But I'm saying that because I'm thinking forward to Tuesday. Shane mentioned that these things weren't being counted early enough. That's still true of at least 33 states in the United States where they aren't allowed to count absentee ballots by mail. I think it's about 23 that can't do it until the morning of the election around about 7 a.m., so next Tuesday. And then there's at least 10 still where they can't start counting them until they're actually have passed and the polls have closed. And that's just, disinformation thrives in those information vacuums. And I think that's what created a lot of the disinformation issues coming out of 2020 and things like 2,000 mules, or things like, election stolen in Maricopa County. Let's all go down there and just point cameras at a building for 3 weeks, right? That's where that thrives. I think that requires a real world answer. I don't know if we're going to be able to moderate that out.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to, in terms of talking about the interaction between online and the real world, I think another really terrifying example of that is actual violence against candidates. Obviously the Paul Pelosi attack being a prominent example of that, but where you now see people feeding on misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories online, and then that becoming a motivation for them to actually act offline in violent ways or things like that. I mean, that's a really scary thought. And if we see more of that kind of thing happening, that has to drive the conversation and has to make it more urgent, I think.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you, Mark Fideli. I'm a communication researcher. I also work for a tech company called Vertical Knowledge, and we're responsible for monitoring narratives and those kinds of things. So this is a semi-large wind-up question, but I'll keep it really short. Education. So one of the premises of 230 is that the educational value of diverse information offsets the other sides of the equation. Is the educational side of the problem brought in enough? For example, young people, and you mentioned it's a political problem that we have fundamentally. If young people are don't even have their executive function working properly to filter, content moderation is also part of protecting their access and their entry point into dialogue, into discussion, into this philosophical inclusion in government that we all share, right? So there's that big educational side to this, and yet 2,000 Mules and all the things that we look at are so now. So I'm thinking of people like Neil Postman and others who focused a lot on the communication side of onboarding young people into politics. Is there enough thinking about the cognitive dimension and the educational dimension as we're talking about free speech, national security, counterterrorism, economics, and algorithms, that there's a long-term problem that we need to study specific to, can people even realistically, cognitively, do their own moderation in a way that when the framers were founding the country, they assumed newspapers and an education, de Tocqueville, we could spend a lot of time on this, assumed a level of knowledge that doesn't exist. So we actually have to think about some congressional scaffolding to bring the level of understanding up so that we can use the internet responsibly. And then within that, talk about regulation. And I know that's many books are being written on this all the time, but my fundamental question is, are there enough educational, stakeholders in the mix on this specific conversation right now to weigh in, or are we getting too lost in the weeds of now, technology, and those sorts of things? And is that going to set us back so that in 5 years, we're kind of chasing our tail still, whatever the new 2,000 Mules is? We'll just end up doing the same thing over and over again, and maybe the market fixes it, but maybe there's something more that can be done with educators involved.
I think a lot of the correct answers to these questions are out there. I think there are good takes and good evidence on why something like 2,000 Mules is not correct. I think there are good takes and good evidence in situations like Maricopa County, which was Sharpies apparently being given only to conservatives so that those votes wouldn't be counted. I think the issue is less with the availability of education and maybe how it's actually delivered. I think it needs to be something in real time. And so Twitter would call this, at least the old Twitter would call this pre-bunking, where you're trying to educate folks, but they have to have the attention to that. Because again, let's go back to Maricopa County. The elections administrator there 2 weeks before the election said that Sharpies could be used. And they actually showed the process of a Sharpie marked ballot going through the counter and working. So they effectively pre-bunked it. I looked at the video, I think 3 days ago, and the elections administrator has something like 200 subscribers, and I think that video had something like 2,000 views. So it's more of an availability for people to actually see it. That's why I'm a big fan of, if we're talking about tools that social media platforms can use to meet these things, I think they need to do it in real time. I think that means we need to have more information flags. I actually liked the old Twitter. You have to actually read the article before you retweet it. It caught me and kept me honest sometimes, I'm not gonna lie. So I think the answers are out there. It's about delivering them in real time, and I think that is a place that social media platforms can be more engaged in.
Yeah, I think there are definitely a lot of conversations I've seen happening about sort of the role of civic education as an important factor, and I completely agree that it is crucial, you know, if people understand how elections are administered, the sort of the nuts and bolts of how government works, I think there's a very good argument that it could undercut some of the falsehoods that are out there. That said, my worry is that, you know, civic education sounds great as a kind of solution in the abstract, but the problem is always going to be in the details, and especially when you look at really extreme anger, frustration, polarization around education in recent years, you know, critical race theory or whatever issue parents are concerned about, I do worry that shifting the focus to civic education will just lead to sort of replaying the same conversations in a different context, which doesn't mean that it's not important, but does mean, I think, that it's not a cure-all.
Last thought?
Sure. I mean, I think one point, you do raise an interesting point in the sense that there actually is, on a policy standpoint, a lot of attention to children online, but it tends to be more from a safety standpoint, and that's an important conversation, of course. But it could be that the policy conversation around children and online should encompass not only the safety aspects, but more of the educational aspects, and thinking about, are there things that we could be doing from an education, digital literacy, or other kinds of educational standpoint.
I think you asked a lot of really good questions. It was a good reminder for me to say that, so AEI has a content project that we are working in collaboration with Brookings. So Quentin and I are working quite a bit with some of our colleagues in this area. Hope you guys will continue to stay tuned to it. Please join in the conversation with us, because this is about us trying to figure this all out kind of collectively as we're going through this. And I want to thank you all for being here in the room, and those of you who are watching, and please thank my panelists for today's conversation.